Hi, welcome to this week's presentation on formative and summative assessments. I would like to start out with a quote that says, "Tests, all by themselves, are neither formative nor summative. It is the use to which a given test results are put that makes the assessment part of the formative assessment process, or instead finds it contributing to the summative assessment design of evaluation." First of all, we will go ahead and talk about summative assessments. Now, to some of you, this is a brand new term. So, summative assessments, according to James Popham, are employed to inform go or no-go decisions. When we think about summative assessments, we are thinking about assessment of learning. It informs decisions about what has already been completed. Some examples that might ring true to most of you are statewide or national accountability tests, the tests that you would take at the end of a chapter, final exams, or some type of report that summarizes what you have been doing in your professional development, in your facilitation, in your instruction, whatever it would be. So summative, if an easy way to remember it, is that it is basically a summary. Now, in some cases, as this quote here on the bottom left says, you can still use summative assessment to figure out if something has been unsuccessful, and you can still modify instructions or decisions that you would make for a course or a program. But for the most part, our summative is usually kind of the big picture of what learners have achieved, what they have gained, and maybe what they haven't achieved and what they haven't gained as well. So the next one I want to talk about is the formative, and this one is a big ticket item. And I think, like Popham said, this is important to remember that a formative assessment is a process and not a test. Why do we need to address formative assessments? Because formative assessment is not a widely used, practiced instructional strategy. In the past, we haven't really, and by past I mean 10, 15 years ago, we haven't truly taught our teachers the importance of using formative assessments in the classroom. And therefore, because they're not used when we're younger, we sometimes don't see them translate into higher education, and even, in any kind of professional development or facilitation that may go on places. So there tends to be a misunderstanding or even just a lack of knowledge on the power of formatively assessing learners. There is also some resistance to altering current curricular conduct because formative assessment is a different way of looking at teaching and looking at gathering data, and it's more real time, and for so long our educational institutions have looked to summative assessments to summarize and say, yes, they got it, no, they didn't, and now it's time to move on. So, we need to be open to using formative assessments in whatever type of educational setting we are in. And then finally, the act of formative assessment doesn't quite mirror what external accountability says is important. And so when we have all these big tests and these final numbers, formative assessment doesn't quite fit in line with those, because number one, you really shouldn't ever count a formative assessment in a grade book. It's always something that you're really truly just gathering information about where your learner is, how they're progressing or how they're not progressing. So formative assessment, in line with the article that you have read, is assessment for learning. We use the assessment elicited evidence in order to improve unsuccessful yet still modifiable instruction. Now, with the summative, we said that this was still possible at times, but with formative, it is truly possible, because formative is something that you do starting at the beginning using any type of pre-assessment to gather data, to gather analysis of your learners, all the way through until the end. And so assessments are formative when the evidence is actually used to adapt the teaching needs the teaching to meet your learners' needs. So we can say we formatively assess, but we have to make sure that we are actually taking that data and we are putting it in a chart, putting it in a grade book, putting it in some kind of observation notes, some kind of record that you're keeping, and you are modifying your instruction based on that data. So some key functions of formative assessment are as follows. Formative assessments will inform instructors about individuals' learning during instruction for the purpose of diagnosing, guiding, and modifying instruction. Okay, so we're going to figure out where are we at, what do we need to do to move forward. It also allows us to provide corrective feedback to learners about their progress. And when we can tell a learner, a student, an adult learner, when we can tell them where they're at in regards to the objectives and the competencies that we have set before them, it helps them get to where we want them to go. So they need to have that feedback to kind of help them down the path to be successful. Formative assessment also enhances learner motivation, and we'll talk about that one a little bit later, so I won't elaborate on that here. The next two slides are a little chart from Macmillan, and it talks about the different impacts that the different types of formative assessment that they can have. So as you can see, this section here on the left is a low-level formative assessment. Here we kind of have something in the middle, and then over here we have a high-level formative assessment. So when you think about the high level, this is really making it something for your learners that is engaging and maybe quick. You're really using that data to move forward. Chances are the students are involved with it. They may be formatively assessing themselves. They may be formatively assessing others. And over here, we have our low-level formative. So as it says right here, this is a little bit more objective and standardized, but I say as long as you're doing it and you're using the data to impact your instruction and guiding your curriculum, that's what's most important. But over here then we have characteristics, so you can see how the different types of formative assessments impact your student learning. What is the structure of your test? As you can see that the low-level formative are probably a little bit more formal, where this one, whoops, I apologize, I'm supposed to say both formal and informal. And then what are the characteristics of the participants involved? As I've said, this is both teachers and students. What does your feedback look like? If it's a little more objective and standardized, chances are it might be a little bit more delayed. But if it's that high level, I'm going to talk to you right now, I'm going to make those observations and collect those notes and take that data in, it's a little bit more immediate and specific. And when is your formative assessment done? This says our low level is mostly after instruction. It could be something where as your learners are ready to leave the room or your classroom, you give them an exit ticket and they write down the two most important things, and then you can go look at that that night, and it can help guide your instruction for the next day. Where our high level formative will happen during instruction. So perhaps you have clickers, or you're letting them use their phones and you're doing a Kahoot quiz or Socrative or something highly engaging there, where you're getting that immediate feedback, and then you know what it is that you need to talk about more in depth and what ideas that you can move forward with because your students or your learners already understand. So then the other chart, or the other half of this chart here, is then a little bit about your instructional adjustments. So again, with our low-level formative, most of what we do is planned out, where our high-level formative is going to be a little bit more flexible. And the flexibility can scare a lot of people, and that's okay. But I think the more you try to use formative assessment, especially on the fly, it probably becomes a little bit more easier to be flexible with it. The choice of task, the student-teacher interaction, you're creating these great relationships with your students that are a little bit more informal. That you're letting the student have, or the learner have, a choice, and there's honest interactions about where they are in regards to the competencies, the objectives, the outcomes that you have. And you can have those conversations about, well, you're not doing so well here, and so here's what we need to do. And that doesn't become you chastising your learners. It becomes more about, hey, I'm here to help you, and I want us to work through this together so that we can all make it to the end goal, which is success in your objectives and your competencies and your outcomes. So the last three, the role of student evaluation. There may not be any in the low level formative, but it's an integral part of the high level. And with our motivation, the more higher level formative assessment we have, the more intrinsic motivation students tend to have as well. And then their attributions for success. This is a great one. When we use low-level formative and a lot of summative, it has to do with external factors like, oh, I studied really hard and I did a great job, or the teacher wrote an easy test, or wow, was I lucky. Where when we get to high-level formative and our students are realizing that they are in control of their learning, and they are able to assess themselves and use data to make their own decisions, the attributions become more internal. Like, I did this. I figured out a plan of how to get from step A to step Z, and that is why I'm successful. And so we can see more contributions to student effort and the ability that our learners have. So there's lots of different types of formative assessment, and I encourage you, if this is a new concept, to go ahead and just Google formative assessment, and there will be so many great ideas that pop up. And even though most of the time formative assessment is discussed in the realm of the PK through 12 classroom, it can be used in any type of educational setting. From little people all the way to people who have been learning and living for decades and decades. And what the formative assessment really can be engaging and informative. So I really encourage you to look over this or look over formative assessment and just get some really great ideas maybe that you could use if you're teaching in an classroom environment right now, or if this is something that you hope to do in the future and kind of start building a list of things that you could do in your educational setting. So I do want to touch real quick here at the end on the enhancing student motivation, because I really do believe that formative assessment can play a big role in this. So with formative assessment, one strives to deliver feedback that is the most useful for the learner, thus reducing the negative effect associated with judgmental nature of evaluation. And we tend to qualify our summative assessments as evaluative, where our formative is informing, and therefore our students and learners can see this feedback and they realize, hey, I have a chance to do something different and to make a different choice and to improve where I'm at and where I'm going. And so it just improves that performance, and as it says down here, it helps support that feeling of self-determination. And we want to see that in learners at every age, and we even want to see that in ourselves. So I think formative assessment is really, really effective with this. The Crooks from 1988, I kind of liked this quote. It just said, formative assessment may actually even reduce anxiety created by assessment and allow students not only to perform better, but to process information necessary for improving learning. It takes the high stakes off of it. And when our students and learners know that they can use the information and they can move forward, it's much less anxiety stricken, I think, than some of us remember school being. So formative assessment occurs during learning, and it tends to evoke attributions of effort rather than ability. Thus, effort becomes the central focus. So that whole piece of what can I do with this data and how can I move forward is really important rather than the evaluative piece. Okay, so what I would like you to think about for a little bit is, how do you see formative assessments enhancing learners' motivation? And what could you improve in your formative assessments that would enhance learner motivation? So, if you're looking for kind of some ideas, think about how will this make the classroom setting more engaging, more focus on active learning and being involved in the information and the data that comes in and allowing your learners to use that and move forward. So there are 5 non-negotiable components of effective formative assessment, and like we've kind of been talking throughout with understanding by design, and when we look at our quality improvement visual, we always want to make sure we clarify and share our learning intentions and criteria for success for our learners. We want to make sure we have effective discussions, questions, and learning tasks that will allow not only the students to participate and give you the kind of information and data you need, but also use that and be engaged with that information and data. We need to make sure that we provide effective feedback that moves any of our learners forward, and we need to activate learners as the owners of their own learning. And I think that's a really big piece. And as we work more with adults, that becomes easier and easier. But for those of you who may go into some undergrad and you're going to be working with freshmen and sophomores, you may see that they're really not still quite responsible for their own learning, and that they depend on the teacher to tell them what to do and to give you the rubric and tell you exactly how the project has to be done. So if you're working with those kinds of learners, really try to push them to become owners of their own work and their own power, and the formative assessment will help you to do that. And with formative assessment, it also encourages learners to be instructional resources for others, because many times our formative assessment is done. They may do it. You may do peer formative assessment. They may evaluate other people's work. They may be evaluating their own work, and so they're learning and growing and becoming resources for each other. So, as in summary, I want you to think about how you choose to use assessment in your educational setting for assessment for learning, which is our formative assessment, your assessment as learning, which is really nice because that can be formative as well, and sometimes I think even a little summative in there can be used as that piece for as learning, and then your assessment of learning, which is generally our summative or summary pieces. Hopefully I know I gave you a little bit of a list of formative assessments, but I hope that you will take some time and Google some more so that you can have a better understanding of formative assessment. And then just make sure throughout any of your instruction, whether it's now or in the future, that you are truly using the evidence about learning to adapt your instruction to meet the learner needs. And when you think about your final project and you think about how formative and summative assessment play a role in developing courses, in revising courses, in developing programs of study, entire curriculum and revising it. Think about the power that the formative and summative assessment and their data and the evaluation